easy sewing tutorial of how I upcycled this blanket into a ruffle mini dress. I have the pattern available on my Etsy, Sewing with Jenn, if you guys want to sew this style for yourself. It's a fitted A-line style with princess seams and gathered ruffles along the hemline. Very beginner friendly. The pattern is layered separately by size for easier cutting. So off to the left is the layers icon. Go ahead and toggle off the sizes you don't want and make sure to leave the piece info visible. To print, have the orientation at auto, scale at actual or 100%, and refer back to the instructions booklet to see the specific page numbers. If you're sewing along, I first want to mention that there's going to be some slight differences with this tutorial compared to your instructions booklet. Since this is an upcycle, I'm working with what I have, and I still wanted to film this and show you guys how I adjust patterns to work with upcycling, so please don't get confused. The main differences are that I added a seam on the back side pieces so that the pattern could fit. I also didn't include the inner facing along the bust, just because I was low in material, and instead I just added the length to the lining. I'm incorporating the existing embroidered eyelet trim and the ribbon insertion trim, but feel free to use whatever trim you want. The measurements are all listed in the instructions, or you can skip it all together. First, we're going to sew the front bust darts and attach the front sides of the bodice to the center front, right sides together. After sewing together the seams I had to incorporate on the back side pieces, I'm now going to attach them to the center back bodice, right sides together. Now that the front and back bodices are done, we can sew them right sides together, making sure to leave space at the notch for the zipper opening. Here I am overlocking all of the raw edges. Now for the lining, we're going to do the same thing as we did for the outer bodice. So sewing the bust darts and the princess seams, and then attaching both the front and the back together along the side seams. And again, leaving space for the zipper opening. So traditionally, we would want the right side of the lining against our body, but since we're using a semi-sheer organza for the ruffle, we don't want the overlocked princess seams of the lining peeking through. So in this case, I want the right side of the lining facing outwards. So decide for yourself, depending on the material you're using. This is going to determine which side you're going to have the zipper opening. If you're sewing along at this point, you would attach the facing, and as I mentioned earlier, I opted to skip the facing since I didn't have enough material, and instead I added length to the lining. Now for the adjustable straps. We're going to fold it in half lengthwise, right sides together, and just sew a straight stitch along the raw edge. Once you're finished, trim off the excess seam allowance and use a loop turner to turn it right sides out. We're going to trim off a portion of the straps to use for the O-ring, about 1.75 inches. Use an iron and press it in half, wrong sides together, and just slide the O-ring through. And for the longer portion of the strap, just insert the slider under one end, over the center, and out the other end. After we align the straps to the notches and sew it in place, we can then combine the two. So we just need to loop the end of the strap through the O-ring, through the slider again for a second time, and then stitch it in place. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're going for, the lining extends past the dress for now until we add in the ruffle. So the ruffle is already gathered with the eyelet trim, so I'm taking advantage of that, and I'm cutting it out with enough seam allowance at the top so I can sew it directly on top of the dress. The reason why we're sewing it directly on top of the dress is just to have less bulk, and because we're using a ribbon trim, we can use that to cover any raw edges. Since my ruffle is already gathered with the eyelet trim, I'm just going to keep it that way and sew them together at the side seams. But if you're sewing along, keep yours separate. So gather your ruffle and sew it together at the side seams, gather your eyelet trim and sew it together at the side seams, and then once you do that, you can layer the trim on top of the ruffle. Since I want the right side of my lining facing outwards, I'm going to have both the dress and the lining right sides out. Then I'm going to insert the dress within the lining, lining up the raw edges, the side seams, and the princess seams. Once that's done, press the seam allowance towards the facing and the lining side of the dress to sew an understitch. And then we're going to sew the ribbon trim directly on top along the upper bust. Just make sure to keep the lining separate. Lining up the zipper and sewing it in place. I'll go ahead and link one of my other videos that goes more in detail with how to sew an invisible zipper with lining. So if you want to check that out. And lastly, we're going to finish the lining with a baby hem. So I already did a straight stitch along the hemline, and now I'm just folding along the stitch line, pressing it inwards. I'm now doing an edge stitch along the folded edge that we just created. Once that's done, trim off all of the excess seam allowance and fold it one more time to hide the raw edge and stitch it in place. And finally, we're finished. I think it looks so cute with the ribbon and the eyelet trim. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for being here.